most of the inputs in a STEM model, at least the numeric ones at least, most of the numeric inputs in a STEM model can be defined as time series. If we look in the demand dialog for a service, obviously things like the unit labels are just text, and the 60 for the annual to busy hour unit ratio is just a scalar. But the vast majority of the other inputs are or can be described as time series. So you have an S-curve here, and most of the other ones are currently constants in this example. I'm going to switch to the user data dialog just to avoid any distractions. And basically, at its simplest, a time series input could be just a constant. More generally, I can change from a whole range of built-in parameterisations. So I can right click here and go change type. For example, I can pick an exponential growth where I've got a base value and a multiplier. Say 1.05 would mean a 5% growth. And if I graph that, it looks like this. Or I could go here and let's number 3, and we could change this to be an S-curve, just as another example. And an S-curve, actually, you might have nothing in year 0, and then in year 1, you might say we have a demand of not very much. And in year 2, we could have a demand of, let's say, 2.5. And again, I can preview this, and then it'll give you some kind of, in this case, rather a steep S-curve. And so there are all sorts of parameterizations available, and all sorts of implied growth you can get from them. So that's all good, and nothing new there. Going back to the constant, the constant type, although you might think it's just the number here, logically it's actually defined as a single inner parameter. It's an inner scalar parameter which says this is the constant value that this time series will have over time. And although that's a bit of a subtle distinction, it is actually subtle enough to cause quite a bit of confusion and a bit of unexpected side effects if you put formulae in the wrong place. And so STEM 7.5 introduces 4 quite subtle changes to the way that the handling of data entry, really, when you enter values or formulae for constants, to make sure that they basically behave the way you expect them to, rather than the way that they logically should, just because there happens to be this inner parameter. So there are 4 of them, and I'm going to go through them one at a time. So the first one is that if you enter a formula on the button, then all of the inner parameters will be overridden unconditionally. So for example, if I go to user 3, it's currently defined as an S-curve. And actually, now I'm not going to use it. I'm going to go back to user 1 because it's better to. I've just remembered. So if I was on user 1, and let's bear in mind that user 1 has this inner parameter saying 1, then I could quite reasonably here enter a new formula. So I want user 1 to be something like, I wanted to get its value from user 4. Now in STEM 7.5, that is going to unconditionally overwrite the inner value that was previously within user 1, and it'll basically make it now entirely controlled by this formula. Whereas in STEM 7.4, it gave you the choice as to whether or not you wanted to replace the existing data, because it allowed you to have the logical construct where you could have this formula getting the value from user 4, but then internally, conceptually, you could override this formula to have a different value in it. And this didn't really serve any useful purpose, and it would be very confusing because you could see the formula and think it looked right, but then you'd get the wrong value. So that's the first change. The second change is that if I choose to enter a formula down here, then, so for example, if I enter a formula here, something like, if I go 1 plus user 2, then when I enter that, it's actually going to treat it as if I had entered the formula up here, i.e. the formula for the button as a whole. And again, that's a very subtle distinction which was mostly lost on the average user. The distinction is that as a time series formula, it means I want the value of this time series to be 1 more than the value of user 2. User 2 is an exponential growth, and so you'd expect user 1 to then be 1 more than that, and you can see from the values over here that it is indeed increasing. Whereas again, in STEM 7.4, if you had entered this formula for the constant parameter, it would have logically said, okay, this is a formula for a scalar. It would have looked at this exponential growth. It would have picked the first value to say, okay, I need a scalar. I'll take the first one. So it would have set the first value to be 3, and it would have then been treated as a constant. Now, if you don't understand that explanation, it doesn't matter because it won't do it anymore. If you've been there before, you should recognize that case, and you'll be happy to know that it doesn't do it anymore. So basically, regardless of whether I enter the formula inside or up here, it'll behave the same way as a formula that you would expect for the time series as a whole. That was 2. The third thing is that if you're using scenarios, then let me put this back to being a constant. So if I have this just as a constant 1, if you were using scenarios, so if I create a dimension down here, and if I was going to set up one of its parameters, then I could either from the formula bar click into here to try and point a parameter at user1.constant, or I could actually be sitting, instead of doing that, I could be sitting over here and I could go to the variance menu and say add as scenario parameter. And in STEM 7.4, it would literally give you a parameter pointing at this dialog. And therein would lie the same problem, because it would think the parameter was literally this scalar parameter. And when it tried to apply the scenario, it could take a time series variant data and try and plug it into this scalar, and it wouldn't be able to do it, and so you'd get just a single value. Whereas you'll see what it's actually done is the parameter it's set up is actually just saying enterprise data.user1. So the parameter is now pointing, if you like, where it should have always have been, which is not to there, which is actually to the button field, the parent field. And that means that whatever if your variant data are time series varying in time, then they'll be copied across to here, not to here, and thereby you'll be able to get the full time series value. As a corollary of that, obviously, if the parameter is pointing here, you expect the variance menu to do the right thing, which is if you're on that parameter, you can't add it again, and instead it allows you to view the variant data, and you can also remove it as a parameter. And the corollary is that if you're down here at the, if you're down here within the inner parameter, the inner constant parameter, and if you go to the variance menu here, even though you're on the constant field, it's going to behave as if you were over here on the parent button, and it's still going to allow you to view the variant data because it still pertains to this field. And you can remove this as a parameter, and obviously it's not going to remove the constant field as a parameter, it's going to remove the time series as a whole. So that's the third thing, and again it's all about trying to get rid of this distinction between the constant parameter and the time series as a whole, even though it is this distinction which is what makes it so critical. And finally, the fourth thing, and actually let me get rid of that dimension just so it's not hanging around to confuse the rest of it. The fourth thing is, the fourth thing is, and this is sort of going back a bit, which is that when I enter a value here, so I enter my 1 or 42 or whatever it is, then although I'm entering it here and I'm displaying it on the screen at this level, logically and in terms of how it really works on the inside, the only place it can actually be stored is within this constant parameter. That's where it has to live. But if you store it here, then in a sense, that wouldn't necessarily reflect what was going on at this level. And it's a bit hard to demonstrate this, but basically, if you imagine that all this data was linked from Excel and all these fields were green, then in STEM 7.4, you could override that with the 42 in here, and you would not see it here because as far as it was concerned, the 42 would be at this level, and at this level, it was just inheriting from Excel. Whereas the first change within 4 is that whatever setness you have here will be reflected at this level. So if it's a set scalar, it'll be shown as set here. And actually, if it's a formula, if it's 42 plus 1, then it'll be shown as a formula. But of course, actually, I've handled that formula at this level, so you're going to see it as a formula anyway. So that's kind of a bad example, but certainly the case where if I've entered it as just as a constant, then it'll appear black here, even though it's actually defined further in. I told you this was a bit subtle. And the second thing is that even though the value actually lives here, Another change with 7.4 is that actually, as well as displaying the value at this level, we're also putting the value in the formula bar to bolster the sense that it lives at this level. It's more consistent with the case where it's defined somewhere else, and it makes it easier to edit an existing constant because you can just go in here and change it exactly as you would at this level. And as a corollary of the corollary, if you can edit the value here and immediately overwrite what's inside, then again, for consistency with how scalar inputs work, what you'll find now is that if I delete the text there and enter this, it will actually unset this field and put it back to being its default. And that's true actually for constant or for any other type. So you have to be a bit careful, because if you go to an exponential growth and enter a blank formula there and press enter, it'll actually unset this as well. So those are the 4 specific changes, and the corollary about stuff inside, and the corollary of the corollary about what happens if you enter a blank formula. There is one further change which we're considering, which is there is this slightly obscure command which allows you to do an unset of the type for a time series. Conceptually, what this means is you unset the type, but allow the types to still potentially have stuff that overrides the original formula. And honestly, it's hard to understand why you would actually want to do that. And we are considering picking up an unset command here and interpreting it as meaning unset the time series as a whole. The only reason we haven't fully decided to do this is it's a bit disconcerting, because at this level, you might not actually be able to see the level above where the formula would actually live, and I can't quite get comfortable with the idea of a command here deleting something you can't see. So that one's still kind of on the drawing board, and the command is so obscure that it's not really that important whether we do it or not. But in summary, the idea is that 7.5 aims to avoid any confusing or conflicting separate use of that constant inner parameter with the actual use of the time series field as a whole, and anything which avoids ambiguity must be a good thing.